Sometimes the people who should love you the most are the first ones to turn their backs. Noreen Clay learned that lesson at 61 when her own family cast her out for being poor and stubborn. She lives alone now in a cabin deep in the northern pines with her 2 dogs, Boone and Sybil. Her half-siblings haven't spoken to her in years. They wanted her to sell their mother's land to cover their debts, but she refused. So they left her behind and forgot she existed. Life became simple. Chop wood, fish the streams, read old letters by lamplight. Then one afternoon, a stranger rides up on horseback with papers that change everything. Noreen just inherited $200 million. What happens when the family that abandoned her finds out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Noreen Clay's life changed forever started like every other morning for the past 3 years. She woke at dawn to Boone's wet nose pressed against her hand, the old German shepherd's way of saying the world was waiting. Sybil, the younger border collie mix, was already at the door, tail wagging with the patient insistence of a dog who knew routines mattered. Noreen pushed back the quilt her mother had stitched 40 years ago, feeling the autumn chill that had crept through the cabin's weathered boards overnight. Her knees protested as she stood, a familiar complaint she'd learned to accept as the price of 61 years on Earth. She pulled on her flannel shirt, the same blue and grey plaid she wore most days, and ran her fingers through her short, silver hair. The cabin her grandfather had built in 1947 sat on 80 acres of northern pine forest, 2 hours from the nearest town of any size. It wasn't much to look at from the outside: rough-hewn logs gone grey with age, a stone chimney that needed repointing, a porch that sagged slightly on the west corner. But it was hers, entirely, completely hers. That mattered more than anything. She let the dogs out and started the fire in the wood stove, watching the kindling catch and spread to the larger splits of pine. The coffee pot went on next, the same blue enamel percolator she'd used since her mother passed. While it heated, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the land that had cost her everything else. The forest stretched in every direction, dense and dark and beautiful. Morning mist clung to the hollows between the hills. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting. Somewhere deeper in the trees, an owl was finishing its night's work. This was her inheritance, not money, not stocks, not anything the bank would accept as collateral. Just land and silence, and the kind of peace that came from knowing exactly who you were. Her half-siblings hadn't understood that 3 years ago when their mother died. Gordon, Lorraine, and Vincent had gathered at the lawyer's office with expectations written on their faces like headlines. They'd assumed the 80 acres would be divided equally, sold quickly, and converted into cash they could use for their various needs and debts and schemes. Then the lawyer read the will. Noreen could still remember the looks on their faces when they learned their mother had left the land solely to her, the daughter from her second marriage, the one they'd always considered something of an outsider. Gordon had turned red, his jowls shaking with barely contained rage. Lorraine had pursed her lips so tightly they'd disappeared entirely. Vincent had simply stared at the table, his silence somehow worse than the other's anger. "This isn't right," Gordon had said, his voice rising. "We're her children too. We have just as much claim to that land." The lawyer had explained calmly that their mother had been very clear in her wishes. The land was Noreen's alone, to do with as she saw fit. Then sell it, Lorraine had demanded, turning to Noreen with eyes that held no sisterly warmth. "The property is worth at least $2 million, maybe more to the right developer. Sell it and split the money 4 ways. That's the fair thing to do." Noreen had looked at each of them in turn, Gordon with his expensive suit and mounting debts from bad investments, Lorraine with her Mercedes and country club membership she couldn't really afford, Vincent with his perpetual look of resignation to whatever the stronger personalities in the room decided. "No," she'd said quietly, "I'm keeping it." The explosion that followed had been 3 years in the making. Gordon had called her selfish, greedy, ungrateful. Lorraine had accused her of manipulating their elderly mother, of taking advantage of a woman whose judgment had been failing. Vincent had said nothing, but he'd left with the others when they stormed out. The phone calls had continued for weeks. Gordon threatening legal action he never followed. Through on. Lorraine alternating between bribes and guilt trips. Vincent sending occasional text messages that said things like, "Please reconsider and think about the family." But Noreen hadn't reconsidered. She'd moved into the cabin permanently, left her apartment in town, and stopped answering their calls. Eventually, they'd stopped calling. Eventually, they'd written her off as the stubborn, foolish woman who'd chosen poverty and isolation over family and common sense. That had been 3 years ago. She hadn't spoken to any of them since. The coffee finished percolating, pulling her back to the present moment. She poured herself a cup and took it out to the porch, where Boone and Sybil were waiting. They'd learned long ago that morning coffee time meant sitting quietly while she watched the sun rise fully above the trees. She settled into the rocking chair her grandfather had made, the wood worn smooth by 3 generations of use. The steam from her coffee rose in the cold air. The dogs pressed against her legs, warm and solid and utterly loyal in ways humans rarely managed. Her mother's Bible sat on the small table beside the chair, its leather cover soft with age and handling. Noreen picked it up and opened it to a random page, a habit she'd developed in the months after the funeral. Today, it fell open to a passage in Proverbs her mother had underlined years ago. "Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice." She smiled at that. Her mother had understood, even if her other children hadn't. There were things worth more than money, worth more than family approval, worth more than the easy path. The day stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm. She'd split wood for an hour after breakfast, then check the fish trap she'd set in the creek. This afternoon she had a small carpentry job in town, building a bookshelf for the library, which paid enough to cover her modest needs. Tonight she'd read by lamplight and listened to the forest, settling into darkness. It was a simple life. Some would call it poor. Her siblings certainly had. But Noreen had everything she needed. She had her mother's land, her grandfather's cabin, her dogs, her peace. She had her integrity intact, which was more than she could say for Gordon with his gambling debts or Lorraine with her maxed-out credit cards. She finished her coffee and stood, ready to begin the day's work. Boone and Sybil followed her inside, where she measured out their breakfast and her own oatmeal with honey, same as always. She ate standing at the counter, looking at the photographs on the wall, her mother as a young woman, her grandfather standing in front of the cabin the year he finished building it, a picture of herself at 20, before marriages and disappointments had taught her what really mattered. There was one photograph she looked at longer than the others. It showed her mother standing next to a man. Noreen barely remembered her, Uncle Theodore, her mother's younger brother. He was smiling in the photo, his arm around her mother's shoulders, both of them young and happy. Noreen had been perhaps 5 when the picture was taken. She'd asked her mother about Theodore once, years later. Her mother's face had closed down in a way that discouraged further questions. "He left," was all she'd said. The family drove him away, and he never came back. Noreen had never learned the full story. Theodore had become a ghost, a name mentioned only in whispers, if at all. By the time she was old enough to ask better questions, he seemed to have vanished entirely from family memory. She washed her dishes and was reaching for her work gloves when she heard something unusual, the sound of a horse approaching through the trees. Visitors were rare. The cabin sat at the end of a logging road that most people didn't know existed. In 3 years she'd had exactly 4 visitors, the mail carrier who came once a month, a lost hiker, a game warden, checking hunting licenses, and a photographer who'd heard about the old-growth pines and wanted to shoot them for a magazine. This was different. The rider was coming deliberately, purposefully, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Boone growled low in his chest. Sybil's ears went flat. Noreen stepped onto the porch and waited. The rider emerged from the tree line, a man in his 50s, wearing a business suit that looked absurdly out of place on horseback in the wilderness. He sat the saddle awkwardly, clearly not an experienced rider. When he saw her, he raised one hand in greeting and urged the horse forward. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and dismounted with visible relief. The horse, a placid brown mare, immediately dropped her head to graze. "Miss Clay," the man called. "Miss Noreen Clay." "Who's asking?" Noreen kept her voice neutral, her hand on Boone's collar. The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather briefcase. He walked forward slowly, showing empty hands. "My name is Lawrence Pemberton. I'm an attorney from Seattle. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, but you don't seem to answer your phone or check your mail." "I don't have much use for phones," Noreen said. "And the mail comes when it comes. What do you want, Mr. Pemberton?" He stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at her with an expression that seemed equal parts professional courtesy and genuine concern. "I need to speak with you about your Uncle Theodore Clay. I believe he was your mother's younger brother?" Something cold moved through Noreen's chest. "What about him?" "I'm afraid he passed away 6 months ago," Pemberton said gently. "I've been appointed executor of his estate, and Miss Clay, I need to inform you that you've been named as his sole beneficiary." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Noreen gripped the porch rail to steady herself. "That doesn't make sense. I haven't seen Theodore since I was a child. I don't even know what happened to him." Pemberton opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope. "Perhaps we could sit down? This is going to take some time to explain." Noreen led Lawrence Pemberton inside, her mind racing with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. The lawyer looked around the cabin's single room with the careful neutrality of someone trained not to judge, though she saw his gaze linger on the wood stove, the absence of electricity, the simplicity of her life. She gestured to the table. "Sit. I'll make more coffee." While the percolator heated, she watched Pemberton arrange papers on her table with practiced efficiency. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, a concession to the cabin's warmth from the fire. His briefcase held manila folders, bound documents, and what looked like photographs. The dogs settled near the door, their eyes tracking the stranger's every movement. Noreen appreciated their vigilance, even as she tried to calm her own racing heart. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "Tell me about Theodore." Pemberton's expression softened. "He was a remarkable man. After he left your family in the late 1972, he moved to Seattle and started working in the early tech industry. He had a gift for identifying promising startups. By the mid-1980s, he'd made his first million. By the 1990s, he was worth considerably more. He was rich." Noreen couldn't reconcile this with the vague memories she had of a quiet, kind man who'd seemed sad even when he smiled. "Very. He invested early in companies that became household names, but he lived modestly, a small apartment, no car, few possessions. He donated generously to environmental causes and land conservation. Most people who knew him had no idea of his wealth." Pemberton slid a photograph across the table. It showed an older man with silver hair and gentle eyes, standing in front of what looked like the Puget Sound. Noreen recognized him. Immediately, those were her mother's eyes, looking back at her. The same shape to the face, the same quiet dignity in his bearing. "He never married? No children?" "No. He told me once that the family had cured him of any desire for close relationships. He preferred solitude." The words hit harder than Noreen expected. She understood that preference, that retreat into isolation, as protection against being hurt again. "What happened? Why did he leave the family?" Pemberton's face darkened. "Your grandfather died in 1978. He left everything equally to his 3 children, your mother Theodore and your uncle Richard. Richard and your mother's first husband, Gordon Sr., wanted to sell the family business and property immediately. Theodore refused. He believed your grandfather had wanted them to keep the business running, to preserve what he'd built. So they forced him out? Worse, they accused him of stealing from the estate, filed a lawsuit claiming he'd manipulated your grandfather in his final days, forged documents, taken money that belonged to all of them. The accusations were completely false, but the damage was done. Theodore spent 2 years and a significant amount of money clearing his name. By the time he was vindicated, the family had already sold everything and split the proceeds between themselves. They never apologized, never acknowledged they'd been wrong. Noreen felt a familiar anger stirring. And my mother went along with this? According to Theodore, she tried to stay neutral, which wasn't much better than joining the attack. Pemberton's voice held a note of carefully controlled judgment. He left after the lawsuit was settled. Never spoke to any of them again. But he knew about me. Noreen heard the vulnerability in her own voice and hated it. He knew everything about you. Pemberton pulled out another folder, thicker than the others. He hired investigators to keep track of the family. Not out of spite, he just wanted to know how everyone was doing. He read every article written about Gordon's business ventures, knew about Lorraine's marriages, followed Vincent's career, and he paid special attention to you. The folder contained newspaper clippings, printed articles, even a few photographs that must have been taken from a distance. Noreen saw herself graduating from high school, standing beside her first husband on their wedding day, teaching a woodworking class at the community college. The collection spanned decades. She couldn't finish the sentence. It felt invasive and touching all at once. He wanted to reach out, Pemberton said gently, many times, but he was afraid of bringing the family's dysfunction back into your life. Then, 3 years ago, something changed his mind. The will reading, Noreen whispered. When my mother left me the land. Exactly. He heard through his investigators what happened afterward, how your siblings treated you, how you chose to keep the land, despite everything they threatened or promised. That's when he decided you were the one who understood what really mattered. Pemberton withdrew a sealed envelope from his briefcase, this one heavier than the others, with Noreen's name written across the front in shaking handwriting. He wrote you a letter, but before you read it, I need to explain the specifics of the inheritance. Noreen's hands were trembling. She clasped them together in her lap, trying to focus. How much are we talking about? The liquid assets total approximately $200 million. There are also several properties, investment accounts, and a portfolio of stock holdings. The total estate is valued at roughly $215 million. The numbers were so large they didn't seem real. Noreen had lived on less than $20,000 a year for the past 3 years. She'd thought herself wealthy, with 80 acres and a paid-off cabin. This was beyond her comprehension. Why me? She asked. Why not split it among all of us? Because he specifically excluded Gordon, Lorraine, and Vincent from any inheritance. His will is very clear on this point. You are the sole beneficiary. Pemberton's expression hardened slightly. He watched them for 40 years, Miss Clay. He knew exactly what kind of people they'd become. They'll contest this. They can try. The will is airtight, and Theodore was very clearly of sound mind when he drafted it 2 years ago. I was present for the signing, along with 2 other witnesses. But yes, they'll probably try. Noreen stood and walked to the window, needing to see the trees, the land, something real and solid to anchor her. Boone came to stand beside her, pressing his warm weight against her leg. $200 million. It would solve every practical problem she'd ever had. She could fix the cabin properly, hire help with the land management, never worry about money again. She could travel, if she wanted to, buy books, have reliable electricity and heat, but she'd learned long ago that money complicated everything it touched. It had destroyed Theodore's relationship with his family. It had turned her own siblings against her. It corrupted and twisted and turned people into strangers. "There are conditions," she said, not making it a question. "3 of them." Pemberton returned to his papers. "First, you must personally oversee the distribution of $50 million to causes you deem worthy within 1 year of accepting the inheritance." Theodore wanted to ensure the money was used to help others, not just hoarded. That actually appealed to her. What else? "Second, you must make a genuine attempt to reconcile with at least one member of your family." Theodore believed his biggest regret was cutting everyone off completely. "He doesn't want you to make the same mistake." Noreen's jaw tightened. "And if I don't want to reconcile with people who treated me like dirt, then you don't have to. Accept the inheritance." Theodore included a provision: if you refuse, the entire estate goes to a land conservation trust. No one else gets anything. Pemberton's voice was gentle but firm. "The third condition is that you cannot give any money directly to Gordon, Lorraine, or Vincent. You can help them indirectly if you choose, pay for medical care, support their children, things like that. But they cannot receive cash or assets from you." He really thought this through. He had 2 years and some of the best estate lawyers on the West Coast. Yes, he thought it through. Noreen turned back to face him. "How long do I have to decide?" 30 days from today. If you decline, the Conservation Trust takes effect immediately. If you accept, we begin the process of transferring assets and setting up the charitable foundation for your distributions. 30 days to decide if she wanted to become one of the wealthiest women in the country. 30 days to figure out if she could handle what that money would bring, the attention, the pressure, the inevitable return of family members who'd abandoned her. "Can I think about it?" Of course. That's exactly what Theodore hoped you'd do. He didn't want you to accept out of greed or impulse. He wanted you to choose deliberately, knowing what you were getting into. Pemberton stood and gathered his papers, leaving only the sealed envelope on the table. "Read his letter. Take your time. I'll be staying in town at the lodge for the next few days. Call me when you're ready to talk again." He handed her a business card and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Clay, Theodore spoke about you with great admiration. He called you the only one in the family who understood that some things can't be bought or sold. That's why he trusted you with this." After he left, Noreen stood in the center of her cabin with the envelope in her hands. Through the window, she watched Pemberton mount the horse with considerably more difficulty than he'd dismounted. The mare plodded back toward the tree line, bearing the lawyer who'd just offered her a fortune she'd never asked for. Boone whined softly. Sybil pawed at her leg. Noreen looked down at the envelope. Her name was written in an old man's careful script, each letter formed with obvious effort. She traced the letters with her finger, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of what it contained. But she didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she set it on the table beside her mother's Bible and walked outside to split wood, needing the familiar rhythm of physical work to quiet her racing mind. The axe rose and fell. Wood split cleanly along the grain. The pile grew larger, and somewhere in Seattle, in a grave she'd never visited, Theodore Clay rested with the knowledge that he'd set something in motion that would test everything Noreen believed about herself, about family, about what really mattered in this world. Noreen didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with Boone's warmth against her feet and Sybil curled at her side, staring at the ceiling beams her grandfather had hewn by hand 78 years ago. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, unopened, calling to her in the darkness. $200 million. The number kept circling through her mind, impossible to grasp. She tried to picture what that much money looked like, but her imagination failed. The most cash she'd ever seen at once was the $12,000 from selling her car when she moved to the cabin permanently. That had seemed like a fortune then, enough to cover her modest needs for a full year. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of money that changed everything it touched. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and lit the oil lamp. The dog stirred but didn't wake fully, accustomed to her occasional nighttime restlessness. She pulled her mother's old cardigan over her nightgown and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The envelope seemed to glow in the lamplight. She made chamomile tea and sat at the table, running her fingers over Theodore's handwriting. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately, to hear what he had to say after 40 years of silence. But another part, the cautious, self-protective part that had kept her sane through divorces and betrayals and family rejection, warned her to wait. Once she read those words, she couldn't unread them. Once she knew what Theodore wanted from her, she'd have to make a choice. Instead, she turned to her mother's things. After the funeral, Noreen had boxed up most of her mother's belongings and stored them in the cabin's small loft. She'd gone through the obvious items: clothes for donation, important papers for filing, photographs for keeping. But there were boxes she'd never opened, things her mother had accumulated over 8 decades that seemed too personal, too private to examine in those early days. Of grief, she pulled down the ladder and climbed into the loft, bringing the lamp with her. Dust motes swirled in its light. The boxes sat where she'd stacked them 3 years ago, labeled in her own handwriting: books, kitchen, papers, personal. She started with personal. The box contained her mother's jewelry costume pieces mostly, nothing valuable, and several smaller boxes that rattled when moved. Noreen lifted out a wooden cigar box that had belonged to her grandfather. Inside were old photographs, the kind with white borders and dates stamped on the back. She found Theodore in the 3rd photo she examined. He was perhaps 25, standing beside a young version of her mother in front of what looked like their childhood home. Both were smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. Her mother looked happy in a way Noreen rarely remembered seeing in later years. Theodore's face was open, unguarded, full of life. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Teddy and me, summer, 1972. Before everything fell apart, Noreen set the photo aside and continued searching. More pictures of Theodore emerged at family gatherings, holidays, ordinary moments. In each one, he seemed to gravitate toward her mother, standing close, heads bent together in conversation. They'd been close, she realized. Really close. Losing him must have hurt her mother deeply, even if she'd never admitted it. Near the bottom of the cigar box, she found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to her mother in Theodore's handwriting, postmarked from Seattle in the early 1982. Her mother had kept them all. Noreen hesitated, then untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. "Dear Jean," it began, "I know you said you didn't want to hear from me, but I can't leave things the way they ended. You're my sister. You'll always be my sister, no matter what Richard and Gordon say about me." The letter went on for 3 pages, Theodore's hurt and anger evident in every line. He wrote about the lawsuit, the accusations, the way the family had turned on him without even asking for his side of the story. He wrote about feeling betrayed, abandoned, cast out for refusing to go along with something he knew was wrong. "You always taught me to stand up for what I believed in," he wrote near the end. "Remember when we were kids and I got in trouble for defending that boy everyone picked on? You told me I'd done the right thing, even if it cost me friends. You said integrity mattered more than being popular. I thought you still believed that." The letter was signed simply, Teddy. Noreen read through the entire bundle, watching Theodore's tone shift from hurt to resignation to a kind of sad acceptance. The last letter was dated 1987. "I won't write again," he concluded. "I can see that hearing from me only makes things harder for you, but I want you to know I don't hate you, Jean. I understand you were caught in an impossible situation. I just wish you'd been brave enough to stand up to them, for both our sakes." Her mother had never responded to any of the letters, Or if she had, Theodore hadn't kept them. Noreen climbed down from the loft with the cigar box and spread the photographs on her kitchen table beside Theodore's unopened envelope. She studied his young face, trying to reconcile it with the story Pemberton had told. A man driven out by his own family, a man who'd built a fortune and lived alone, a man who'd watched her from a distance for decades, waiting to see if she'd prove herself different from the others. She picked up another photograph, this one from what looked like a Christmas gathering in the early 1972. Theodore sat on the floor in front of the tree, a small child on his lap. Noreen's breath caught when she recognized herself. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, wearing a red dress and holding a stuffed rabbit. Theodore was pointing at something on the tree, and little Noreen was laughing. She had no memory of this moment. No memory of Theodore as anything but a vague presence, a name whispered and then forgotten. But here was proof that he'd been real, that he'd held her and made her laugh, that they'd had some kind of relationship before the family destroyed it. Dawn was breaking when she finally opened Theodore's envelope. The letter inside was written on thick, expensive paper in the same shaking handwriting from the envelope. It was dated 18 months ago. "Dear Noreen," it began, and something in her chest tightened at seeing her name in his hand. "I've started this letter a dozen times over the past 20 years. Each time, I convinced myself I had no right to contact you, that I'd be dragging you into old family drama you were better off not knowing about, that my silence was a gift, not a betrayal. Then I heard what happened after your mother died, how Gordon and Lorraine and Vincent treated you, how they demanded you sell land that was rightfully yours, and when you refused, they cut you off completely, cast you out like you were nothing to them. It broke my heart. Not because I was surprised I've watched them long enough to know exactly what they're capable of, but because I recognized the story. It was my story, replayed with you in my role. The family finds someone with integrity, someone who won't compromise their principles for money, and they destroy that person for it. I've spent 40 years alone, Noreen. 40 years convincing myself it was better this way, that solitude was safer than risking being hurt again. And in many ways that was true. I built a good life, made more money than I ever needed, supported causes I believed in, slept well at night knowing I'd never compromised who I was. But I also spent 40 years wondering what might have been different if even one person in the family had stood up for me, if Jean had found the courage to tell Richard and Gordon they were wrong, if someone had chosen me over money and convenience. I can't change my past, but I can offer you something different. The inheritance you're being offered comes with conditions. Pemberton will explain them all. The money itself isn't the point. I don't care if you live in a mansion or stay in that cabin you love. What matters is that you have choices. Real choices. The kind I never had when the family came after me. More than that, I want you to know you were right. Keeping that land, standing your ground, refusing to let them bully you into betraying what you knew was right, you were absolutely right. Don't let anyone ever tell you differently. Your mother would be proud of you, even if she never learned how to say it. I know I am. Use this money however you see fit. Help others who've been cast out by their families. Protect land that developers want to destroy. Or just live comfortably knowing you don't have to split wood in your 60s if you don't want to. The thing I ask is that you don't let bitterness make you as isolated as I became. That's the one condition I really care about. Find your way back to at least one person. Not for them, for you. Because 40 years alone taught me that being right isn't the same as being happy. With love and admiration, Uncle Teddy. Noreen read the letter 3 times, tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. Boone pressed against her leg, whining softly. Sybil laid her head on Noreen's lap. Theodore had understood, completely, perfectly understood what it meant to be cast out by people who should have loved you, what it cost to stand your ground when everyone else called you stubborn and foolish, what it felt like to be alone with nothing but your integrity and the knowledge that you'd done the right thing. He'd been watching her. All these years, he'd been watching, waiting to see if she'd prove strong enough to withstand what the family would do. And when she'd chosen the land over their approval, he'd decided she deserved this. Not the money itself, she still wasn't sure what to do with that. But the validation, the proof that someone had seen her choice and understood it and honored it. She set the letter down and looked at the photograph of herself as a child on Theodore's lap. What would her life have been like if he'd stayed? If the family hadn't driven him away, would she have had an ally, someone who understood her in ways no one else ever had? But he hadn't stayed, and she'd grown up without him, learning the same hard lessons he'd learned a generation earlier. That family meant nothing if it wasn't built on something more than blood. That money corrupted everything it touched, that sometimes the only way to keep your soul intact was to walk away from everyone and everything, no matter how much it hurt. The sun was fully up now, spilling golden light through the cabin windows. Noreen stood and stretched, feeling the weight of a sleepless night in her bones. She had 29 days left to decide. 29 days to figure out if she could handle what accepting this inheritance would mean. She looked at her mother's Bible, at Theodore's letter, at the photographs of a family that had destroyed itself over money once before. History had a way of repeating itself. The question was whether she was strong enough to break the pattern, or if accepting Theodore's gift would just start the cycle all over again. Boone barked at the door, reminding her that whatever else was happening, the dogs still needed to be fed, and the day's work still needed doing. Noreen folded Theodore's letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she went to feed her dogs and split more wood and try to figure out how to honor a dead man's wishes without losing herself in the process. For 6 days, Noreen kept Theodore's inheritance secret. She went about her usual routines, morning coffee on the porch, work around the cabin, the occasional trip to town for supplies. She tried to pretend that her life hadn't just been turned inside out by a dead uncle she barely remembered and a fortune she'd never asked for. But everything felt different now. The cabin that had always seemed sufficient now looked shabby in new ways. The hand-me-down furniture, the cracked dishes, the patched-together life she'd built, she saw it all through different eyes, aware that with one signature she could replace everything, or keep it exactly as it was, knowing the choice was finally hers alone. She walked the property every afternoon with the dogs, studying the land with renewed attention. 80 acres of old-growth pine, 3 natural springs, a creek running through the north section, deer trails and bear sign, and the patient work of beavers on the water's edge. This was what her mother had given her. This was what she'd fought to keep. Theodore's letter had asked her to protect land like this, to help others who needed defending. She could do that now, could buy up adjacent parcels before developers got them, could establish conservation easements that would last forever. The money could ensure this forest survived long after she was gone. But first, the family had to find out. She knew they would. Pemberton had warned her that estate transfers of this size left paper trails, court filings, public records, tax documents. Once the 30-day clock ran out and she signed the acceptance papers, someone would notice. Someone always noticed when this much money changed hands. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. On the 7th morning after Pemberton's visit, Noreen was replacing a section of porch railing when she heard her cell phone ringing inside the cabin. She almost ignored it. The phone was a concession to practicality more than desire, left plugged in and rarely answered. But something made her set down her tools and check the screen. Gordon, calling from a number she'd deleted from her contacts 3 years ago, but still recognized. She let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Gordon, again. She declined the call. Then a text message appeared. Need to talk. Important family matter. Please call. Noreen stared at the screen, her stomach knotting. They knew. Somehow, Despite Pemberton's assurances about confidentiality and the 30-day waiting period, they knew about the inheritance. She didn't call back. Instead, she finished the railing repair and took the dogs for a walk deep into the forest, where cell service disappeared and the only sound was wind in the pines and her own careful breathing. But when she returned to the cabin 2 hours later, a car was parked in her clearing. Vincent stood by the porch steps, looking uncomfortable and slightly guilty. He'd aged since she'd last seen him, grayer, thinner, with new lines around his eyes. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, dressed down in a way that felt calculated to put her at ease. "Noreen," he said as she approached, "I'm sorry to just show up like this." She stopped 10 feet away, the dogs pressed against her legs. "How did you find out?" "Gordon has a friend who works in estate law, heard something about a filing involving the Clay family name. He did some digging." Vincent had the grace to look ashamed. "We weren't supposed to know yet. The paperwork isn't even final." "But Gordon, you know how he is." "I know exactly how he is." Noreen's voice was flat. "What do you want, Vincent?" "To talk. Just talk." He raised his hands, showing empty palms. "Can I sit down?" She gestured to the porch steps and leaned against the railing, arms crossed. The dogs positioned themselves between her and Vincent, watching him with careful attention. Vincent sat slowly, studying the cabin and the clearing with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've done well with the place. It looks good." "I didn't know maintenance counted as doing well, but thank." "That's not what I meant." He was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Gordon's losing his mind. Lorraine, too. They heard that Uncle Theodore died and left everything to you. $200 million, Noreen, is it true?" There was no point in lying. "Yes." Vincent's face went through several expressions: shock, envy, resignation, something that might have been genuine concern. That's life-changing money. I haven't decided whether to accept it yet." "What?" He stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "Why wouldn't you accept it?" "Because I know what it'll mean. I know what you and Gordon and Lorraine will want, what you'll expect, what you'll demand." She kept her voice steady, controlled. "Money like that doesn't come without complications. We just want to talk." But his eyes slid away from hers when he said it, and she knew he was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. "Vincent." She waited until he looked at her again. "Tell me the real reason you're here. Not the version Gordon told you to say. The real one." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Gordon's in trouble. Real trouble. He owes money to people who aren't patient about collecting debts. If he doesn't pay soon, he's going to lose everything: his house, his business, maybe worse. And he thinks I'll bail him out. He thinks family should help family when times are hard. Which is rich coming from him, I know. After how we treated you." Vincent rubbed his face with both hands. "Lorraine's in debt too, not as bad as Gordon, but bad enough. She made some poor investments, trusted the wrong financial advisor. Her retirement fund is gone. That's not my problem. I know it's not. I know we have no right to ask you for anything after what we did. How we turned our backs on you when you needed us." He looked at her with something that might have been genuine remorse. "I'm not proud of that, Noreen. I should have stood up for you, should have told Gordon and Lorraine they were wrong to force you to choose between the land and the family. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the forest. "I told myself I was staying neutral, that it wasn't my fight. But really, I was just a coward. Easier to go along than to stand up to them." Noreen felt something shift slightly in her chest. She'd expected Vincent to come with demands and justifications, with all the self-serving logic Gordon and Lorraine would use, but this honesty, this admission of fault, she hadn't prepared for that. "Why are you really here, Vincent?" she asked again, more gently this time. He turned to face her. "Because Gordon sent me to convince you to share the inheritance. And because I wanted to apologize before he and Lorraine show up and make everything worse. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and held it out to her. This is from Lorraine. A letter. She asked me to give it to you. Noreen took the envelope but didn't open it. And Gordon doesn't do letters. He'll show up in person with lawyers and arguments and whatever leverage he thinks he has. Vincent's expression darkened. He's already talking about contesting the will. Claims Uncle Theodore must have been senile, that you manipulated him somehow. I never even met Theodore as an adult, never spoke to him. I know. Gordon knows too. But he's desperate, and desperate people tell themselves whatever they need to hear. Vincent walked down the steps toward his car, then paused. For what it's worth, I think Uncle Theodore chose right. You're the only one of us who deserved it. The only one who'd use it for something more than paying off debts and buying things we don't need. Vincent. She waited until he looked at her. Thank you for being honest. It matters. He nodded and got in his car. She watched him drive away, the dust from his tires settling slowly back to earth. After he left, she sat on the porch and opened Lorraine's letter. It was 2 pages of apologies and explanations, talking about misunderstandings and family bonds and how they were all getting older and needed to put the past behind them. Reading between the lines, Noreen could see what Lorraine really wanted: access to the money, presented as reconciliation. She folded the letter and set it aside. Then she picked up her phone and called Pemberton. They know, she said when he answered. Gordon found out somehow. He's going to make this difficult. I was afraid of that. Pemberton's voice was calm but not surprised. Are you ready to make your decision? We can move forward immediately, get ahead of whatever Gordon's planning. Noreen looked at her cabin, at the land beyond, at Boone and Sybil lying in the sun. She thought about Theodore's letter, his 40 years alone, his hope that she wouldn't make the same mistake. She thought about Vincent's honesty and Lorraine's calculated apology and Gordon's desperation. Not yet, she said. I still have 23 days. I want to use them. Understood. But Noreen, be prepared. When people know this much money is at stake, they stop being reasonable. They stop being the people you remember. Sometimes they stop being human at all. After the call ended, she sat in the gathering dusk and wondered if she had the strength for what was coming. Theodore had survived being cast out by his family and built something meaningful from the wreckage, but he'd also spent 40 years alone, isolated by choice and by the wounds that never quite healed. She could take the money and use it exactly as Theodore hoped, to protect land, to help others, to make sure she never worried about survival again. But she'd be inviting Gordon and Lorraine back into her life, fighting them off, proving over and over that she deserved what she'd been given. Or she could refuse it all. Let the Conservation Trust have the money. Keep her quiet life, her 80 acres, her peace. Stay cast out but stay safe. The dogs pressed against her legs as the stars came out overhead. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. The creek murmured over stones worn smooth by time and patience. And Noreen Clay sat in the darkness, trying to decide if $200 million was worth the price it would surely exact. Noreen knew she couldn't avoid it forever. She had to understand exactly what Theodore's conditions meant, had to see all the legal details that would bind her if she accepted. So on the 8th morning, she drove to town and met Pemberton at the small office he'd rented above the hardware store. He'd spread documents across a folding table: trusts, tax forms, investment portfolios, charitable foundation templates. The sheer volume of paperwork made her head hurt. "Walk me through it," she said, settling into a plastic chair. "All of it. I need to understand what I'm actually agreeing to." Pemberton nodded with what looked like approval. "Most people just ask about the total and where to sign. The fact that you want details tells me Theodore chose well." He pulled out a leather folder. "Let's start with the conditions, since those are what matter most." He opened the folder to reveal a letter, not Theodore's handwriting this time, but formal legal language typed on law firm stationery. But paperclipped to it was a handwritten note from Theodore that Pemberton hadn't mentioned before. "He wrote this the day before he died," Pemberton said quietly. "Asked me to show it to you when you were ready to hear the full story." Noreen took the note with hands that weren't quite steady. "Noreen, if you're reading this, it means you're taking this seriously." "Good. The lawyers have written everything in language that protects you and the estate, but I want you to understand what I actually meant, not just what the legal documents say. Condition 1. Distribute 50 million to worthy causes. I don't care who or what. Environmental groups, sure, but also people. Individual people who need help the way I once needed help, and nobody gave it. The woman about to lose her family farm. The old man who can't afford his medical bills. People like you who got cast out or pushed aside. Find them. Help them. You'll know who deserves it. Condition 2. Reconcile with one family member. This is the one I wrestled with most. I don't want you to reconcile with people who hurt you if they haven't changed, if they're just pretending because money is involved. Real reconciliation means someone genuinely understands what they did wrong and is trying to be better. If none of them can manage that, then maybe reconciliation means accepting that some wounds don't heal, and that's okay too. But try, for your sake, not theirs. Because 40 years of cutting everyone off taught me that being right isn't the same as being whole. Condition 3. Gordon, Lorraine, and Vincent get nothing directly. This one's non-negotiable. I watched them for decades. I know exactly what they do with unrestricted access to money. But here's what the lawyers won't tell you. There's nothing stopping you from helping them indirectly if you choose. Medical bills for their children. College funds for grandkids. The kinds of things that actually help rather than enable bad behavior. You're smart enough to know the difference. The money doesn't matter, Noreen. What matters is that you have choices. Real, meaningful choices about how you live and who you help and what you protect. That's what I never had when the family came after me. That's what I want you to have now. Trust yourself. You've earned that right. Teddy. Noreen read the note twice, feeling Theodore's presence more strongly than she had from the longer letter. He'd understood the difference between the letter of the law and its spirit. He'd known she'd need that clarity. "So the reconciliation," she said slowly, "it doesn't have to be Gordon or Lorraine. It could be Vincent. If you believe his remorse is genuine, yes." Theodore didn't specify which family member. He left that judgment to you. And I can help Gordon and Lorraine if I want to, just not by writing them checks. Correct. The restriction is on direct transfers of cash or assets. You could establish a trust for medical expenses, or education, or housing. You could pay off specific debts if you felt it was warranted. But they can't access the principal, can't sell anything you provide, can't turn your help into liquid assets they'd immediately squander. Noreen sat back, processing. Theodore had been more thoughtful than she'd realized. He hadn't wanted her to become as isolated and bitter as he'd been. But he also hadn't wanted her to be manipulated by people who saw her only as a source of money. "Show me the rest." For the next 2 hours, Pemberton walked her through the financial details. The investment portfolio, carefully constructed to generate income while preserving capital. The properties. Theodore owned a cabin in the North Cascades, a small apartment building in Seattle, 2,000 acres of old-growth forest in Oregon that he'd been protecting from logging companies. He lived in the Seattle apartment, Noreen asked, for 40 years. Modest place, 1 bedroom, filled with books and not much else. He kept the cabin for when he needed absolute solitude. The forest land was his passion project. He spent millions buying up parcels before developers could get them. Theodore had lived the way she did, simply, deliberately, focused on what mattered rather than what impressed others. The money had been a tool, not a trophy. "The distribution requirement," she said. 50 million in 1 year. That's a lot of decisions to make. We can set up a foundation with an advisory board if you want help. Most people do. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. If I'm going to do this, I'll do it myself. Theodore trusted me to choose. I'm not outsourcing that to people who don't understand what he wanted. Pemberton smiled. He said you'd say that. He left notes about you, you know. Observations from over the years. He called you stubborn as a mule and twice as principled. Said you'd rather do everything the hard way than compromise your standards. He wasn't wrong. Noreen looked at the document spread before her. The life-changing decision rendered in legal language and property deeds. Can you walk me through what happens if I refuse? How does the Conservation Trust work? The money would go to an existing organization. Theodore had vetted the Northern Forest Alliance. They'd use it to buy and protect land throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern Mountain states. It's a good organization. They'd honor his wishes. But the 50 million distribution requirement wouldn't happen. No individual people would be helped. No, it would all go to land conservation. Pemberton's expression was carefully neutral, which is valuable work, but not the same as what Theodore envisioned if you accepted. Noreen stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Town was quiet this morning, a few pickup trucks, the hardware store doing steady business, the diner with its usual breakfast crowd. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, most of them one bad break away from losing everything. She'd been one of them until a week ago. She understood how precarious life was when you had nothing in reserve, when illness or accident or simple bad luck could destroy everything you'd built. Theodore wanted her to help people like that. People the world had cast aside or forgotten. Could she really walk away from that responsibility just because accepting it would be hard? There's something else you should know, Pemberton said from behind her. Gordon contacted me yesterday. Through his lawyer. He's demanding to see the will, challenging its validity, threatening to file complaints with the Bar Association about my handling of the estate. Can he actually do anything? No. The will is airtight, and I've followed every procedure exactly. But he can make noise. He can draw attention. He can make this process miserable for everyone involved. Pemberton's voice hardened slightly. He's also started calling people in town, asking questions about you. Your mental state, your isolation, whether you seem competent to manage your own affairs. Anger flared hot in Noreen's chest. He's trying to build a case to have me declared incompetent. I believe so. It won't work. You're clearly of sound mind. You have no history of mental illness or impaired judgment. But it shows how far he's willing to go. Noreen turned from the window. If I refuse the inheritance, Gordon gets nothing. It all goes to the Conservation Trust. He knows that, right? His lawyer does. I've made it very clear. Then what does he think he's accomplishing? I don't think he's thinking clearly at all. I think he's desperate and angry and looking for any avenue of attack. Pemberton gathered the documents into organized stacks. Which brings us back to your decision. You have 22 days left. But the longer you wait, the more time Gordon has to cause problems. Noreen sat back down, suddenly tired. Tell me honestly, if I accept this, will the rest of my life be one long fight against my siblings trying to get what they think they deserve? Probably not. Once the money is formally transferred and the trusts are established, their legal options disappear. They might keep asking, keep pressuring, but they'd have no actual claim. He paused. But will they resent you? Will they make your life uncomfortable when they can? Yes, almost certainly yes. And if I refuse? Then you keep your 80 acres and your quiet life. Gordon and Lorraine get nothing, which will enrage them, but there's nothing they can do about. You'll be exactly where you are now, just without the burden of managing a fortune or the guilt of refusing Theodore's last wish. The guilt. That was the real weight, wasn't it? Theodore had watched her for years, had recognized something in her that he'd once seen in himself, had trusted her with not just his money but his legacy. Refusing felt like betraying that trust, like proving she wasn't who he'd believed her to be. But accepting meant fighting, meant dealing with Gordon's attempts to manipulate or intimidate her, meant watching every decision be scrutinized by people who thought they knew better how to spend money they'd never earned. "I need more time," she said finally. "I need to understand what reconciliation actually looks like, whether any of them are capable of being genuine." Pemberton nodded. "Then take the time. But be careful. When this much money is at stake, people become strangers to themselves. The siblings you remember might not be the people who show up at your door." Noreen drove home through afternoon light, her mind churning with numbers and possibilities, and the weight of decisions she'd never imagined having to make. The cabin appeared through the trees like a promise of simplicity, of a life that made sense even when the world didn't. But she knew now that simplicity was an illusion. The world had found her again. The family had found her again. And whether she accepted Theodore's inheritance or refused it, nothing would ever be quite the same. That night, Noreen did what she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She opened her mother's journal. She'd found it the week after the funeral, tucked inside the Bible like a secret her mother had meant to keep. But Noreen hadn't been ready then to read her mother's private thoughts, to hear confessions or regrets that might change how she remembered the woman who'd raised her. Now, with Theodore's inheritance forcing her to confront family history, she needed to understand. To know if her mother had felt the same guilt Theodore wrote about, or if she'd made peace with driving her brother away. The journal was small, bound in cracked brown leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. Her mother's handwriting covered maybe half of it, entries scattered across the final 2 years of her life. Noreen made tea, settled into her grandfather's rocking chair with a blanket over her knees, and began to read. The early entries were mundane: doctor's appointments, grocery lists, notes about the garden. But halfway through, the tone shifted. November 3rd. Saw a documentary tonight about tech millionaires in Seattle. Couldn't help wondering if Teddy was one of them. Probably not. He was never interested in attention or status. But wherever he is, I hope he's happy. I hope he forgave us for what we did. Noreen's throat tightened. Her mother had thought about Theodore, had carried him with her all those years. She turned pages, finding more references scattered through months of ordinary life. December 10th. Richard called today, asking if I'd heard from Teddy. Says he wants to make amends before it's too late. I told him Teddy made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with any of us. Richard seemed surprised, like he couldn't understand why his brother would hold a grudge over ancient history. Some people never learn that betrayal isn't ancient history to the person betrayed. January 22nd. Gordon's in financial trouble again. He asked if I could loan him money, got angry when I said no, told me I was selfish, that family should help family. The irony is almost funny. Where was that family loyalty when we drove Teddy away? Where was it when Gordon Sr. and Richard accused him of stealing from his own father's estate? Family loyalty is something Gordon invokes when he needs something, then forgets the moment it costs him anything. The entries painted a picture Noreen had never seen: her mother wrestling with guilt, understanding too late the damage they'd done. Understanding and unable to fix it. March 8th. Noreen called today. She sounds tired. I wish I could tell her what I've learned about family, about money, about standing up for what's right even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. But I failed that test with Teddy. Who am I to give advice about integrity when I let my brother be destroyed for refusing to compromise his? Noreen had to stop reading, wiping tears from her face. Her mother had seen her struggle, had understood what was coming, but hadn't known how to help. Hadn't trusted herself to give advice she'd failed to follow. She read on, finding the entries from the final months of her mother's life. October 15th. The lawyer came today to update my will. I'm leaving the land to Noreen. Gordon and Lorraine will be furious, but it's the right choice. She's the only one who understands that some things can't be measured in money. She's like Teddy that way, principled, stubborn, willing to stand alone rather than compromise what she believes. I hope it doesn't cost her as much as it cost him. I hope she finds people who understand her in ways we never understood Teddy. But if not, if she ends up alone like he did, at least she'll have the land. At least she'll have something that matters. November 2nd. Getting weaker. Doctor says maybe 6 months. I find myself thinking about Teddy more and more, wondering if he's alive, if he ever thinks about us, if he knows how sorry I am. I wrote him letters over the years. Never sent them. Too afraid of his anger, or worse, his indifference. Now it's too late for apologies. But maybe it's not too late for Noreen. If she stands her ground about the land, and I know she will, she's too much like Teddy not to. Gordon and Lorraine will turn on her. They'll say terrible things, make terrible accusations, try to force her to choose between the family and her principles. I hope she chooses her principles. I hope she's stronger than I was. I hope she doesn't spend 40 years wishing she'd been brave enough to do the right thing when it mattered. The final entry was dated 3 days before her mother died. Noreen sat with me today, held my hand and told me stories about the land deer she's seen, repairs she's planning, how peaceful it is in the early morning. She doesn't know I'm leaving it all to her yet, doesn't know the storm that's coming. I wanted to warn her, wanted to tell her about Teddy, about what we did to him, about how families destroy the people who won't compromise. But I'm too much of a coward even now, so I'll leave her the land and hope it's enough, hope she understands why I chose her. She reminds me so much of Teddy, the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be something she's not, just to make others comfortable, the same loneliness that comes from being the only honest person in a room full of liars. If Teddy is still alive somewhere, I hope he knows I'm sorry. I hope he knows I understood finally what he was trying to tell us all along, that some things matter more than money. That integrity isn't negotiable. That family means nothing if it's built on betrayal and greed. Noreen understands that. She'll protect the land, no matter what they threaten. She'll stand alone if she has to. And maybe, somehow, that will make up for what we did to Teddy. Maybe her courage will redeem our failure. I hope so. God, I hope so. Noreen closed the journal and sat in the darkness, her mother's words echoing through her mind. Her mother had known, had understood exactly what was coming, and had given Noreen the land anyway, hoping she'd be strong enough to survive what the family would do. And she had been. She'd stood her ground, lost her siblings, chosen isolation over compromise. Just like Theodore had done 40 years earlier. The pattern was so clear now, it hurt to see. The family had a template for dealing with people who wouldn't. Go along, vilify them, cast them out, erase them from the family story. They'd done it to Theodore. They'd done it to her. And if she accepted his inheritance, they'd try to do it again, but this time with legal challenges and competency hearings and whatever weapons desperation gave them. But her mother's journal revealed something else too. Theodore wasn't the only one who'd watched from a distance, hoping Noreen would prove different. Her mother had watched too, had hoped Noreen's courage would somehow make up for her own failure to stand up for her brother. Noreen picked up Theodore's letter again, reading it with new understanding. He'd asked her to reconcile with one family member, not because he thought they deserved it, but because he'd spent 40 years understanding what total isolation cost. He didn't want her to make the same mistake. But reconciliation couldn't happen with people who hadn't changed, who were still driven by the same greed and entitlement that had destroyed Theodore. It had to be genuine or it meant nothing. Vincent had apologized, had admitted his cowardice and expressed real remorse. That was something. Maybe not everything, but something. Gordon and Lorraine, though she'd seen nothing from them except calculation and manipulation. Lorraine's letter had been full of pretty words, with no substance behind them. Gordon hadn't even bothered with pretense, just sent Vincent to feel out the situation while he prepared his legal assault. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vincent. Gordon's planning to visit you tomorrow. Bringing his lawyer. Wanted you to know. She typed back. Thank you. Another message came through. I meant what I said. You deserved this. He chose right. Noreen set the phone down and looked around her cabin at her grandfather's furniture, her mother's Bible, the photographs of Theodore scattered across the table. 3 generations of her family had struggled with the same question. What do you do when the people who should love you make that love conditional on getting what they want? Theodore had chosen isolation and wealth and 40 years of watching from a safe distance. Her mother had chosen compromise and regret and a deathbed wish that her daughter would be braver than she'd been. Noreen had chosen the land and solitude and a life built on her own terms. Now Theodore was offering her a 4th option. Wealth without isolation, the power to help others without compromising herself, the resources to protect what mattered while still finding her way back to connection with at least one person who deserved it. But accepting that option meant fighting, meant facing Gordon's lawyer and Lorraine's manipulation and the endless questions about whether she deserved this, whether she was competent to handle it, whether Theodore had been in his right mind when he chose her. She thought about her mother's journal entry. Maybe her courage will redeem our failure. And Theodore's letter. Don't let bitterness make you as isolated as I became. And Vincent's text. He chose right. Noreen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest in darkness. Boone and Sybil flanked her, warm and solid and loyal. She'd built a good life here. A simple life. A life where she didn't have to fight for every inch of ground, didn't have to prove herself to people who'd already decided she wasn't worth their time. But Theodore had given her a choice, and choosing the easy path would be another kind of betrayal. Not of him, he'd understand if she refused, had built in the conservation option specifically so she wouldn't feel trapped. But of everyone else like them, everyone who'd been cast out and needed someone with resources and understanding to help them back up. Gordon could bring his lawyer, Lorraine could write her manipulative letters. They could challenge and accuse and threaten all they wanted. She'd faced them down once before, she could do it again. And this time, she'd have Theodore's money behind her and his legacy to honor, and the knowledge that her mother had hoped she'd be brave enough for exactly this moment. The decision crystallized in her mind, solid and certain. She'd accept the inheritance. She'd face whatever Gordon and Lorraine threw at her. She'd find a way to genuinely reconcile with Vincent if his remorse was real. And she'd spend the rest of her life making sure Theodore's money went to people who needed it, who deserved it, who'd been cast out by their own families and needed someone to finally stand with them. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be simple, but it would be right. And after 61 years of watching her family choose money over integrity, Noreen knew exactly how rare and precious that was. Gordon arrived at noon the next day, pulling up in a BMW that looked too expensive for a man who claimed to be drowning in debt. A second car followed a sedan containing a man in a grey suit carrying a 27 briefcase that practically screamed, "Lawyer." Noreen watched from the porch, her coffee gone cold in her hand. She'd been expecting this, but that didn't make it easier. Boone growled low. Sybil's hackles rose. "Easy," Noreen murmured to the dogs. "Let's see what they've got." Gordon climbed out of the BMW, and Noreen was struck by how much he'd aged since she'd last seen him. He had to be pushing 70 now, his hair more grey than brown, his face lined with years of stress and poor decisions. But his eyes were the same, hard, calculating, sure of his own righteousness. "Noreen," he called, not quite managing a friendly tone. "We need to talk." "Then talk. You didn't need to drive all the way out here with a lawyer to do that." Gordon's jaw tightened. "This is Richard Chen. He's been advising me on estate matters." The lawyer stepped forward with an oily smile. "Miss Clay, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I didn't invite you. You showed up." Noreen stayed on. The porch, the dogs flanking her. She wasn't going to make this easy for them. Gordon pulled papers from his jacket pocket. "I've been going through Uncle Theodore's will. There are irregularities. Such as the fact that he left everything to you, cutting out his other blood relatives entirely. Such as the suspicious timing he conveniently dies right after you're estranged from the family, leaving you a fortune that just happens to solve all your financial problems." Noreen felt ice forming in her chest. "I never spoke to Theodore, never contacted him, didn't even know he was alive until Pemberton showed up." "So you say." Richard Chen stepped forward, his smile never wavering. "But without objective verification, we only have your word for that. And given your isolated lifestyle, your limited social connections, your choice to live in poverty when better options were available, there are questions about your judgment and your fitness to manage an estate of this magnitude. Are you suggesting I'm incompetent? I'm suggesting that someone who chooses to live like this—" Chen gestured at the cabin with barely disguised contempt when she could have accepted her family's help, "might not be thinking clearly. My thinking is perfectly clear. I chose to live independently rather than sell land that belonged to my mother. That's called having principles, not incompetence." Gordon jumped in. "We're not trying to attack you, Noreen. We're trying to protect you. This inheritance is going to bring attention, pressure, people trying to take advantage of you. You need help managing it. Professional help. And you're offering? We're offering to be a resource, to help you make good decisions, to ensure the money is handled properly." Gordon's voice took on a pleading quality that might have been convincing if his eyes hadn't been so cold. "We're family, Noreen. We should work together on this. The same family that hasn't spoken to me in 3 years, the family that called me selfish and stubborn and told me I'd regret not doing what you wanted." "We were angry," Gordon admitted. "We said things we didn't mean. But that's in the past. What matters now is making sure this inheritance benefits everyone." There it was, the real agenda, barely disguised. They wanted access to the money, dressed up as concern for her welfare and family unity. Chen pulled out more papers. "We've prepared a proposal. A family trust that would manage the inheritance with you as primary beneficiary, but with oversight from your siblings. It would protect you from predatory individuals and ensure the money is used wisely. Oversight." Noreen kept her voice flat. "Meaning Gordon and Lorraine would have control." "Meaning we'd all have input," Gordon said. "Meaning you wouldn't be alone trying to manage something this complex. I haven't even accepted the inheritance yet." Gordon's mask slipped for just a moment, showing the desperation underneath. "You have to accept it. You can't just let $200 million go to some conservation trust when the family needs help. The family didn't need help 3 years ago when you cut me off for refusing to sell my mother's land. That was different." "How?" Gordon's face flushed red. "Because that land was worth maybe $2 million, split 4 ways. This is $200 million that could help all of us, could solve real problems, could pay off your gambling debts." Noreen kept her voice level, watching Gordon's eyes widen. "Could bail out Lorraine's failed investments, could fund whatever schemes you've both got running that require more money than you've managed to earn or keep." "Who told you that?" Gordon's voice turned harsh. "Does it matter? It's true, isn't it?" Chen tried to regain control of the conversation. "Miss Clay, your siblings' financial situations are irrelevant to the question at hand. What matters is that you're being offered an opportunity to rebuild family relationships while managing a significant inheritance responsibly. Refusing that offer raises questions about your motivations and your judgment." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Chen?" "I'm explaining the reality of the situation. A competency challenge, while unfortunate, is something Mr. Gordon has every right to pursue if he has genuine concerns about your ability to manage your affairs." Chen's smile had teeth now. "Living alone without electricity or modern amenities, minimal social contact, no spouse or close friends to provide perspective, a documented history of making decisions that left you in poverty. These things paint a picture of someone who might not be capable of handling complex financial matters. Noreen understood now. This wasn't just Gordon asking for money. This was a coordinated legal strategy to have her declared incompetent so they could seize control of the inheritance before she ever had a chance to accept it. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "Noreen, be reasonable. Get off my property." She let steel enter her voice. "Both of you. Now, before I call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing." Gordon's face twisted with anger. "You're making a mistake. We tried to do this the friendly way, tried to be reasonable, but if you won't cooperate, we'll do what we have to do to protect this family's interests." "The family's interests? You mean your interests?" Noreen descended the porch steps, and the dogs moved with her, making Gordon take a step back. "Theodore specifically excluded you from his will for a reason, Gordon. He watched you for 40 years and knew exactly what kind of person you'd become. Same with Lorraine. He didn't want either of you touching his money because he knew you'd waste it like you've wasted everything else. How dare you?" "I dare because it's true. You drove Theodore out of this family over money 40 years ago, accused him of things he never did, destroyed his relationship with everyone he loved. And now you're trying to do the same thing to me." She pointed toward the road. "Leave. And don't come back." Chen stepped forward, all pretense of civility gone. "You'll be hearing from us officially, Miss Clay. We're filing a competency petition within the week. We have witnesses prepared to testify about your mental state, your isolation, your inability to maintain normal social relationships. By the time we're done, no court will let you manage a $200 million inheritance. Do whatever you think you can do." Noreen kept her voice steady, despite the fear rising in her chest. "But understand this: if you challenge me, if you try to take control of Theodore's estate, you're not just fighting me. You're fighting his explicit wishes, documented over years with some of the best lawyers on the West Coast. And you'll lose." "We'll see about that." Gordon climbed back into his BMW, Chen following to the sedan. Before driving away, Gordon rolled down his window. "You've always been stubborn, Noreen. Always had to do things your way, no matter who it hurt. Well, this time your stubborn streak is going to cost you everything." They left in a spray of gravel and dust. Noreen stood in the clearing until the sound of their engines faded completely, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Boone pressed against her leg. Sybil whined softly. "It's okay," Noreen told them, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "We're okay." But even as she said it, she understood the magnitude of what Gordon was threatening. A competency challenge would mean doctors, evaluations, testimony from people in town who might not understand her choices. It would mean dragging her private life into public court records, having strangers judge whether she was sane enough to live the way she wanted. And even if she won, which Pemberton seemed confident she would, the process would be exhausting, expensive, and humiliating. She pulled out her phone and called Pemberton. "They were here," she said when he answered. "Gordon and his lawyer. They're threatening a competency petition." Pemberton swore softly. "I was afraid of this. What did they say exactly?" She repeated the conversation as precisely as she could remember. Pemberton listened without interrupting, and she could hear him typing notes. "All right," he said when she finished. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to have you evaluated by a psychiatrist of our choosing, someone impeccable, someone whose testimony will demolish any claims about your mental state. Second, we're going to document everything about your life, your carpentry work, your financial management, your property maintenance. Show that you're more than capable of handling your affairs. Third, I'm going to file a motion to have any competency petition dismissed as frivolous harassment. Will it work? It should. But Noreen, you need to be honest with you, this is going to get ugly. Gordon is desperate, and desperate people fight dirty. Are you prepared for that?" She thought about Theodore, falsely accused and betrayed by his own family. She thought about her mother's journal, the regret that had haunted her final days. She thought about standing on her porch and watching Gordon drive away with threats hanging in the air. "I'm prepared," she said. "Theodore survived this. So will I." "Good, because we need to move quickly. I'm going to petition the court to accelerate your decision timeline. If you're ready to accept the inheritance, we should do it now, before Gordon can file his challenge. Once the estate is formally transferred, it becomes much harder for him to contest your competency." "I'm ready." The words came without hesitation. "I'm accepting the inheritance. All of it. All the conditions. Everything Theodore wanted." "Are you sure?" "Once we file the acceptance, there's no going back." Noreen looked at her cabin, at the land that had cost her everything else, at the dogs who'd never questioned whether she was competent enough to deserve their loyalty. She thought about Theodore, watching from Seattle for decades, waiting to see if she'd prove strong enough. She thought about the $50 million he wanted her to distribute to people who needed it, people like her who'd been cast out and needed someone to understand. "I'm sure," she said. "Draw up the papers. I'll sign them today." After the call ended, she sat on her porch steps and let the reality wash over her. She'd just committed to accepting $200 million and everything that came with it, the responsibility, the pressure, the fight with siblings who'd rather see her destroyed than see her honored for who she was. But she'd also committed to finishing what Theodore started, to helping people he couldn't reach, to proving that sometimes the cast-out, stubborn ones were exactly the right people to trust, with power and money and the chance to make things better. Gordon thought he was fighting for his inheritance. Lorraine thought she deserved a share of family wealth. But Noreen understood what this was really about. It was the same fight Theodore had faced 40 years ago, the same fight that had driven him away and left him alone for the rest of his life. The difference was that Theodore had fought alone. Noreen had his money, his lawyers, and his faith that she was strong enough to win. That would have to be enough. Pemberton arrived at dawn the next morning, his car loaded with documents and a notary public who looked like she'd been pulled out of bed too early. They set up on Noreen's kitchen table, spreading papers across the surface where she usually ate her simple meals. "This is the acceptance document," Pemberton explained, pointing to a thick stack bound with a blue cover. "Once you sign this, the estate transfers to you immediately. The trusts activate, the trust's conditions take effect, and you become legally responsible for everything." Theodore left. Noreen picked up the pen, then paused. "Tell me again what happens if Gordon files his competency petition after I've signed." "It becomes much harder for him. Once you're legally in control of the estate, he has to prove not just that you're incompetent now, but that you were incompetent at the moment of signing. With me and a notary as witnesses, that's nearly impossible." Pemberton's expression was grim but confident. "He can still file. He probably will. But it won't accomplish what he wants." The notary, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and steel-grey hair, leaned forward. "Miss Clay, I need to ask you some questions for the record. Do you understand what you're signing today?" "Yes. I'm accepting my uncle's inheritance and all the conditions that come with it." "And you're doing this of your own free will, without coercion or pressure?" "I am." "Do you understand the financial and legal implications of managing an estate of this size?" Noreen met Patricia's eyes steadily. "I understand that it's a responsibility I didn't ask for, but that I'm choosing to accept. I understand that I'll be managing approximately $200 million, that I'm required to distribute $50 million to worthy causes within 1 year, that I need to attempt genuine reconciliation with at least one family member, and that I cannot give money directly to my half-siblings. I understand all of it." Patricia nodded and made notes on her forms. "Then I'm satisfied you're competent to proceed." Noreen signed her name on 12 different pages, initialing sections, dating documents. Each signature felt like a small act of defiance against Gordon and everyone else who'd assumed she wasn't capable of this. With each stroke of the pen, she claimed Theodore's faith in her, accepted his challenge, took on the burden and the gift he'd offered. When it was done, Pemberton countersigned. As executor, Patricia notarized everything with her official seal, and Noreen Clay became one of the wealthiest women in the northern states. She felt exactly the same as she had 10 minutes earlier. "Now what?" she asked. "Now we file these with the court today, which makes the transfer official. I'll send copies to Gordon's lawyer so they can't claim they weren't informed. And we start the real work, setting up your charitable foundation, establishing the trusts, protecting your assets." Pemberton pulled out another folder. "I took the liberty of drawing up documents for a conservation easement on this property. If you sign it, this land can never be developed, never be sold for anything except conservation purposes. It'll be protected forever." Noreen took the documents, reading through the legal language that would ensure her mother's land. Her grandfather's land stayed wild and whole long after she was gone. This was what she'd fought for 3 years ago. This was what had cost her her family. Now she could guarantee it would never be threatened again. She signed without hesitation. After Pemberton and Patricia left, Noreen walked the property with a surveyor's eye, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just her home anymore. This was the first piece of land protected by Theodore's money, the first act of the legacy he'd asked her to build. But the conservation easement was the easy part. The real challenge, the condition that had kept her awake the past 2 nights, was reconciliation. She pulled out her phone and texted Vincent, "Can you meet me? Need to talk. Alone." He responded within minutes. "When and where?" "Tomorrow, noon, the cabin. I'll be there." That night, Noreen went through her mother's journal again, paying special attention to the entries about Vincent. Her mother had been kinder to him than to Gordon or Lorraine, noting his weaknesses but also his basic decency. "Vincent has always been a follower," one entry read. "He goes along with whatever Gordon decides because it's easier than standing up to him. But I've seen moments when Vincent looks uncomfortable with their schemes, when he knows they're wrong but can't find the courage to say so. Maybe he'll grow a spine someday. I hope so. There's good in him, buried under all that cowardice." Could cowardice be forgiven if it was acknowledged and regretted? Could reconciliation happen with someone who admitted their failures, even if they couldn't undo them? Theodore seemed to think so. His condition didn't require perfect people, just genuine ones. Vincent arrived exactly at noon, driving an older pickup truck instead of the newer car he'd had last time. He climbed out slowly, and Noreen noticed he was limping slightly. "Bad knee," he explained when he saw her watching. "Surgery next month, if I can figure out how to pay for it." They sat on the porch steps, the dogs between them, the forest quiet around them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Vincent said, "Gordon's furious. Says you signed the papers yesterday, that his lawyer called him this morning to tell him the estate transferred. I did. He's going to fight this. Going to file his competency petition, going to drag you through court, going to do whatever he thinks will work." "I know." Vincent looked at her, his expression pained. "I tried to talk him out of it. Told him it was wrong, that you had every right to the money, that Uncle Theodore knew what he was doing. Gordon wouldn't listen. Said I was being weak, said if I wasn't with the family then I was against them. And which are you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I'm tired, Noreen. Tired of going along with Gordon's schemes. Tired of watching him destroy everything he touches. Tired of being too much of a coward to stand up to him." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm 64 years old. When do I finally grow up and do the right thing? You could start now." "By doing what?" Noreen chose her words carefully. Theodore's will had 3 conditions. One was distributing money to help people. One was protecting Gordon and Lorraine from their own worst instincts by not giving them direct access to funds, and one was attempting genuine reconciliation with at least one family member. Vincent's eyes widened slightly. "You're thinking about me? I'm thinking about whether your apology was real, whether you actually regret how you treated me, or whether you're just trying to position yourself to get something from me that Gordon can't." "It was real." His voice cracked slightly. "Noreen, I've regretted walking out of that lawyer's office for 3 years. I should have stayed, should have told Gordon and Lorraine they were wrong to demand you sell the land, should have stood up for you the way nobody stood up for Uncle Theodore. But you didn't." "No, I didn't, and I can't take that back." He looked at the forest, at the land they'd fought over. "I can tell you I'm sorry. I can promise I'll do better, but I can't prove it except by my actions going forward, and I understand if that's not enough." Noreen studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. She'd learned to read people over 61 years, learned to distinguish genuine emotion from performance. Vincent looked exhausted, ashamed, and sincere. "Your daughter," she said, "the one who needs medical care. What's wrong with her?" Vincent's expression softened. "Chronic kidney disease. She needs a transplant, but she's not high enough on the list yet. Meanwhile, dialysis 3 times a week, medications that cost more than she makes, constant struggle to keep working while staying healthy enough to qualify for the transplant when it comes. And you've been helping her financially." "As much as I can, which isn't much. My retirement savings are gone. Had to take out a second mortgage on my house. Still not enough." He looked at Noreen with desperate hope he was trying to hide. "I wasn't going to ask. I know what Theodore's will says about not giving money to us directly. But if you were willing to help Stephanie, to pay her medical bills or help with the transplant costs, I'd—" His voice broke. "I'd owe you everything." This was the test, Noreen realized. Theodore had forbidden direct transfers to her siblings, but he'd left room for exactly this kind of help. Medical care for Vincent's daughter wasn't enabling Vincent's bad behavior, it was helping an innocent person who'd done nothing wrong. But more than that, it was a chance to see if Vincent's remorse was real. If she helped Stephanie and Vincent responded with genuine gratitude rather than demands for more, that would tell her everything she needed to know about whether reconciliation was possible. "I'll help Stephanie," Noreen said quietly. "I'll set up a medical trust that pays her bills directly, dialysis, medications, transplant costs when the time comes. She'll never have to worry about affording her care." Vincent's eyes filled with tears. "Noreen, I can't. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because she needs help, and because Theodore wanted me to use this money to help people who deserve it. Your daughter qualifies." Noreen paused. "But Vincent, if you take this as permission to start asking for more, if you use this to pressure me or manipulate me or align yourself with Gordon's schemes, I'll cut you off completely. Do you understand?" "I understand. And I won't. I swear I won't." He wiped his eyes roughly. "This is more than I deserve, more than I had any right to hope for. It's what families should do for each other when someone needs help. Real help. Not enabling or bailing out self-inflicted disasters." She stood, and the dog stood with her. "I need you to do something for me in return. Anything. Testify for me if Gordon's competency petition goes to court. Tell the truth about what happened 3 years ago, about why the family turned on me, about Theodore, and what the family did to him. Can you do that?" Vincent stood too, meeting her eyes directly. "Yes, I can do that. I will do that." They stood in silence for a moment, and Noreen felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness exactly, that would take time, would require Vincent to prove himself through consistent actions, but a possibility. A small opening where reconciliation might grow if it was tended carefully. "Gordon's going to see this as betrayal," Vincent said quietly. "Probably. He'll cut me off. Tell Lorraine to do the same. I'll be alone in the family, just like you've been. Yes, Noreen said, but you'll be alone with your integrity intact. And sometimes that's worth more than being surrounded by people who only want you for what you can give them. Vincent nodded slowly. Uncle Theodore understood that, didn't he? He did, and he spent 40 years hoping someone else in the family would understand it, too. After Vincent left, Noreen called Pemberton and explained what she'd agreed to. That's well within the bounds of Theodore's conditions, Pemberton confirmed. A medical trust for Vincent's daughter is indirect assistance, focused on genuine need. And if Vincent is willing to testify about the family history, that's incredibly valuable for defending against Gordon's petition. What about the reconciliation condition? Does helping Vincent count? If his remorse is genuine and you're building a real relationship, yes. Theodore didn't require full reconciliation with multiple family members, just a genuine attempt with one. If you and Vincent can find your way back to some form of connection that fulfills the condition. Noreen looked at the acceptance document still spread across her kitchen table, at her new reality, rendered in legal language and notary seals. She'd accepted Theodore's money. She'd protected her land forever. She'd found a path to reconciliation that honored both Theodore's wishes and her own boundaries. Now came the hard part, managing the inheritance, distributing the $50 million, and surviving whatever legal assault Gordon was preparing. But she wasn't alone in it. She had Pemberton's expertise and Vincent's testimony and Theodore's careful planning, protecting her from every angle he'd been able to anticipate. And she had something Gordon and Lorraine would never understand. She had the moral high ground, the certainty that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it cost you everything. That certainty had sustained Theodore through 40 years of isolation. It would sustain her through whatever came next. She spent the afternoon drafting a list of causes for her $50 million distribution. Land conservation trusts. Obviously, Theodore would want that. But also programs for family reconciliation, counseling, support for people estranged from their relatives, financial assistance for those cast out or cut off. She'd help people like herself and Theodore, people who'd chosen integrity over approval and paid the price, people who needed someone to finally stand up and say, "You were right. Your choice mattered. Here's help so you don't have to fight alone anymore." By evening, she had 20 pages of notes and ideas, more purpose than she'd felt in years. The money wasn't a burden, it was a tool, and Theodore had given it to exactly the right person to wield it. Boone and Sybil pressed against her legs as darkness fell. She sat on her porch and looked at the forest. Theodore's money would now help protect. At the cabin her grandfather built that would stand here long after she was gone, at the stars emerging overhead, like promises the universe kept faithfully every night. Gordon could file his petition. Lorraine could write her manipulative letters. The family could do whatever the family did when confronted with someone who wouldn't compromise. Noreen had been cast out before. She'd survived it. She'd built a life from the wreckage. This time, she'd do the same thing, but with $200 million and a dead uncle's faith that she was strong enough to handle it. She suspected that would make all the difference. The competency petition arrived by courier 3 days later, a thick envelope containing Gordon's formal challenge to her mental fitness. Noreen read through it at her kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as she absorbed the accusations rendered in legal language. The petition claimed she exhibited signs of impaired judgment, citing her choice to live without electricity, her isolation from society, her refusal to maintain appropriate family relationships, and her suspicious acceptance of an inheritance from an uncle she'd supposedly never met. It requested a full psychiatric evaluation and temporary suspension of her control over the estate, pending the court's determination of her competency. Attached were affidavits from people in town, the hardware store owner who said she seemed withdrawn and uncommunicative, a former neighbor who claimed she'd always been odd, the banker who noted she'd lived at the poverty level despite other options being available. None of it was false exactly, but all of it was twisted to suggest mental instability rather than deliberate choice. The cruelest part was an affidavit from Lorraine, detailing what she called Noreen's increasingly erratic behavior over the years, her paranoid refusal to maintain family ties, and her delusional attachment to worthless land. Lorraine painted a picture of a woman slowly losing touch with reality, retreating into isolation because she couldn't cope with normal life. Noreen set the petition down and looked around her cabin at the order she maintained, the careful budgeting that kept her fed and housed, the purposeful life she'd built according to her own values. Nothing about her existence was delusional or impaired. She'd simply chosen differently than people like Lorraine could understand. Pemberton called an hour later. "You've seen it?" "Yes." "Your response?" "When do we fight back?" She heard satisfaction in his voice. "I've already filed our counter-motion. We're requesting an expedited hearing, presenting evidence of your competency and documenting Gordon's financial motivation for this challenge. We've also filed a complaint about the frivolous nature of his petition. This is clearly harassment, not a good faith concern about your welfare. What do I need to do?" "Meet with Dr. Sarah Brennan tomorrow. She's a psychiatrist I've worked with before, impeccable credentials, completely neutral. She'll evaluate you, and her testimony will demolish Gordon's claims. After that, we prepare for the hearing, gather documentation of your life, financial records, work history, property maintenance logs, anything that shows you're fully capable of managing your affairs." Noreen spent the rest of the day assembling evidence of her competency, bank statements showing careful budget management, contracts for carpentry work with satisfied customer reviews, photographs documenting the repairs and improvements she'd made to the cabin, letters from the librarian thanking her for the beautiful bookshelves she'd built. It felt absurd, having to prove she was sane enough to live the way she wanted. But she understood Gordon's strategy: make her defend every choice, justify every preference, explain why she wasn't what normal people expected, exhaust her with the burden of proof until she gave up or gave in. He didn't understand that she'd been defending her choices her entire life. This was nothing new. Dr. Brennan arrived at the cabin the next morning, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She spent 4 hours with Noreen, asking questions, administering assessments, observing how she lived. "Tell me about your decision to live without electricity," Dr. Brennan said, taking notes. "It's not that I'm against electricity. I use it when I go to town, obviously. But out here, solar would be expensive to install and maintain, and I've gotten by fine with oil lamps and a wood stove. It's a practical choice, not an ideological one. Your family suggests this choice indicates impaired judgment. My family thinks any choice that doesn't prioritize comfort and convenience indicates impaired judgment. We disagree about values, not reality." Dr. Brennan smiled slightly. "Tell me about Theodore. Why do you think he left his money to you?" Noreen explained Theodore's history, her mother's journal, the pattern of the family casting out anyone who wouldn't compromise principles for profit. She showed Dr. Brennan Theodore's letters, her mother's writings, the documentation of 40 years of family dysfunction. "So you see yourself as similar to Theodore?" Dr. Brennan asked. "I see us as people who made the same choice in different generations. And I see the family responding the same way both times, by attacking our competency rather than questioning their own behavior." By the end of the evaluation, Dr. Brennan was nodding. "Miss Clay, you're one of the most rational, well-adjusted people I've evaluated in years. Your choices are unconventional but entirely logical given your values and priorities. You have excellent reality testing, appropriate emotional responses, clear thinking, and strong executive function. There's absolutely no evidence of any mental impairment. Will you testify to that?" "Emphatically. And I'll make it clear that this petition is exactly what you said, an attempt to pathologize values different from the mainstream." The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Pemberton prepared her for what to expect. Gordon's lawyer would try to make her seem strange, disconnected, incapable of rational decision-making. She'd need to stay calm, answer clearly, and trust that the evidence would speak for itself. Vincent called the night before the hearing. "I'm testifying tomorrow. Gordon knows. He showed up at my house tonight, said if I spoke against him in court I was dead to him, that he'd make sure Lorraine and the rest of the extended family cut me off too. What did you tell him?" "That I was telling the truth, no matter what it cost me." Vincent's voice was steady despite the obvious fear underneath. "Stephanie's medical trust is already active. You followed through on your promise before the hearing, before I'd proven anything. That means something to me. It means I finally have to be the person I should have been 3 years ago." "Thank you, Vincent. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you hear what I'm going to say about Gordon's real motivations." The morning of the hearing, Noreen, dressed in simple, clean clothes, nothing fancy, but nothing that would let Gordon paint her as unstable or impaired. She braided her silver hair, put on her mother's small gold earrings, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman in her 60s who'd lived according to her own principles and was tired of having to justify that to people who'd never understood her. The courthouse was a 2-hour drive. Pemberton met her in the parking lot, briefcase in hand, expression confident. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, wood-paneled and formal. Gordon sat on one side with his lawyer Richard Chen and Lorraine beside him, both dressed expensively. Vincent sat on Noreen's side, a visible statement of which side he'd chosen. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holloway, with steel-grey hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every manipulation attempted in her courtroom and wasn't impressed by any of it. Chen presented Gordon's case first, calling witnesses who testified about Noreen's isolation, her refusal of family help, her bizarre choice to live in poverty. He made it sound like she was a hermit who'd lost touch with reality, sustained by delusions about the importance of undeveloped land. Then Lorraine took the stand. "I've worried about Noreen for years," she said, her voice trembling with false concern. "After our mother died, she just withdrew completely. Stopped answering calls, refused to see us, acted like we were her enemies instead of her family. When we tried to help her, tried to ensure she'd be taken care of financially, she became paranoid. Accused us of trying to steal from her. It broke my heart to watch her deteriorate like that." Pemberton stood for cross-examination. "Miss Clay, isn't it true that what you call trying to help actually meant demanding Noreen's cell? Land your mother specifically left to her. We suggested she consider selling, yes, for her own good. For her own good? Or because you and your brother wanted access to the proceeds? We all would have benefited, including Noreen, who specifically didn't want to sell." Lorraine's mask slipped slightly. She was being unreasonable. That land was worth millions. Living in that cabin like someone from another century, while money was just sitting there in real estate value. Of course, we thought she wasn't thinking clearly. "So to be clear, your concern about her mental state began when she refused to do what you wanted with property that legally belonged solely to her. That's twisting my words. Is it? Or is this entire petition just another attempt to force Noreen to give you access to money that isn't yours?" Judge Holloway sustained Chen's objection, but the point had been made. Noreen watched Lorraine return to her seat, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Then it was their turn to present evidence. Dr. Brennan took the stand first, her credentials impressive enough that even Chen looked worried. She spoke clearly and firmly about her evaluation of Noreen. "Miss Clay demonstrates excellent cognitive function, appropriate emotional regulation, clear reality testing, and rational decision-making abilities. Her choice to live simply is a values-based decision, not a symptom of mental illness. In fact, her ability to maintain a functional, self-sufficient lifestyle on minimal income suggests strong executive function and practical intelligence. Chen tried to shake her testimony. But isn't it unusual for someone to choose to live without modern conveniences when they could afford them? Unusual isn't the same as impaired. Many people choose simpler lifestyles for environmental, philosophical, or personal reasons. Miss Clay's choices are well within the range of normal human behavior. What about her isolation? Her lack of close relationships? She has relationships appropriate to her lifestyle and personality. She's not agoraphobic or socially dysfunctional. She simply prefers solitude and selects her social contacts carefully. That's temperament, not pathology. Dr. Brennan leaned forward slightly. Mr. Chen, if we pathologized everyone who prefers their own company to constant social interaction, we'd be declaring half of Montana mentally incompetent. Light laughter rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway's expression suggested agreement. Then Vincent took the stand. Pemberton guided him through his testimony carefully. Mr. Clay, you're Noreen's half-brother, correct? Yes. And you were present when your mother's will was read 3 years ago? I was. Can you describe what happened? Vincent took a breath and began. Our mother left 80 acres of land solely to Noreen. Gordon and Lorraine were furious. They immediately demanded she sell it and split the money 4 ways. Noreen refused. She wanted to keep the land, honor our mother's wishes. Gordon called her selfish. Lorraine accused her of manipulating our mother. They told her if she didn't sell, they'd cut her off from the family entirely. And did they? Yes, we all did. We stopped calling, stopped visiting, acted like she didn't exist, because she wouldn't give us what we wanted. Vincent's voice was thick with shame. I went along with it. I didn't stand up for her. I was too much of a coward to tell Gordon and Lorraine they were wrong. Why are you testifying now? Because this petition isn't about concern for Noreen's welfare. It's about money. Gordon is desperate. He's in debt from gambling, facing bankruptcy, needs cash immediately. But the will specifically excludes him. So he's trying to have Noreen declared incompetent so he can control the money himself. Chen objected strenuously, but Judge Holloway overruled him. This goes to motivation, Mr. Chen. I'll allow it, Vincent continued. Gordon did the same thing to Uncle Theodore 40 years ago, accused him of theft, sued him, drove him out of the family. All because Theodore wouldn't go along with selling our grandfather's business. The family has a pattern: when someone won't compromise their principles for money, we destroy them. We did it to Theodore, we did it to Noreen, and now Gordon's trying to do it again with this petition. Do you believe your sister is mentally incompetent? No. I believe she's the sanest person in our family. She knows what matters and what doesn't. She chose land and peace over money and family approval. That's not crazy, that's wise. Chen's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Vincent's motives, suggested he was only testifying because Noreen had promised him money, accused him of betraying his family for personal gain. Isn't it true that Miss Clay set up a medical trust for your daughter just days before this hearing? Yes. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? She helped my daughter because Stephanie needs help. She helped because that's what families should do. Help people with genuine needs, not enable destructive behavior. So you're testifying in exchange for financial assistance? I'm testifying because it's the truth. Gordon is lying about Noreen's competency, and I'm not going to stay silent this time. Pemberton called several more witnesses: the librarian who praised Noreen's work and reliability, the hardware store owner who admitted under questioning that withdrawn really just meant quiet, neighbors who confirmed she maintained her property well and caused no problems. Finally, Noreen took the stand. Pemberton walked her through her life choices, letting her explain in her own words why she lived the way she did. She spoke about her grandfather building the cabin, her mother's love for the land, the value of simplicity and self-sufficiency. "Why did you refuse to sell the land 3 years ago?" Pemberton asked. "Because it wasn't about money. My mother left it to me because she knew I'd protect it, because she understood that some things are worth more than their monetary value. Selling it would have been a betrayal of everything she wanted and everything my grandfather built." "And the inheritance from Theodore, why do you think he chose you?" "Because he recognized the same pattern repeating. He'd been cast out for refusing to compromise his principles. He saw the family doing the same thing to me. He wanted to give me what no one gave him: resources to fight back, to prove that choosing integrity over approval was the right decision." Chen's cross-examination tried to portray her as delusional about the land's importance, unstable in her attachment to isolation, irrational in her refusal of family help. "Miss Clay, don't you think it's abnormal to choose a life of poverty when better options were available?" "I didn't choose poverty. I chose the land." "There's a difference. You could have sold the land and still lived comfortably. I could have betrayed my mother's trust and still lived comfortably. I chose not to. That's not mental illness, Mr. Chen. That's called having a backbone." Judge Holloway's lips twitched in what might have been approval. Chen tried several more angles, but Noreen remained calm, clear, and consistent. She wasn't defensive or angry, just tired of having to explain herself to people who'd already decided she was wrong. After closing arguments, Judge Holloway took less than 20 minutes to reach her decision. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented here today. I've examined the psychiatric evaluation, the witness statements, and the petitioner's claims. Here's what I've found. Miss Clay is demonstrably competent to manage her own affairs. Her lifestyle choices, while unconventional, are rational and consistent with her stated values. Her decision-making regarding property and finances shows clear thinking and appropriate judgment. Furthermore, I find that this petition was filed in bad faith. Mr. Gordon Clay's motivation appears to be financial rather than concern for his sister's welfare. The timing of this petition, immediately after Miss Clay accepted a substantial inheritance that specifically excludes the petitioner, strongly suggests this is an attempt to circumvent the explicit wishes of Theodore Clay's will. The petition for competency evaluation is denied. Miss Clay retains full control of her estate and her affairs. Additionally, I'm awarding costs and attorney fees to Miss Clay to be paid by the petitioner. This court will not be used as a tool for family members to harass each other over money." Gordon's face went purple with rage. Lorraine sat frozen, disbelieving. Chen gathered his papers with barely controlled fury. Noreen felt something release in her chest: relief, vindication, the end of a fight she'd been waging her entire adult life. Pemberton leaned over and whispered, "You won." Vincent caught her eye from across the courtroom and nodded once, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Outside, on the courthouse steps, reporters were waiting. Someone had leaked that this was about a $200 million inheritance, and the media loved stories about family fights over money. Noreen made a brief statement, Pemberton at her side. "My uncle Theodore Clay left me his estate because he believed I would honor his wishes and use his money to help others. That's exactly what I intend to do. My family tried to prevent that by attacking my competency. The court has confirmed what I've always known. I'm perfectly capable of managing my life and my affairs according to my own values. Thank you." She didn't take questions, just walked to Pemberton's car with Vincent following. "Where to?" Pemberton asked. "Home," Noreen said. "I have work to do." 6 months later, Noreen stood on her porch at sunrise, coffee warming her hands, watching mist rise from the forest. Boone and Sybil pressed against her legs, their presence as familiar and comforting as the land itself. The cabin looked much the same as it had before Theodore's inheritance. She'd made only modest improvements. Solar panels now powered a few lights and a small refrigerator, concessions to practicality rather than comfort. The porch had been properly repaired, the roof reshingled, the chimney repointed, but the essential character remained unchanged. This was still her grandfather's cabin, still the home she'd chosen over family approval. What had changed was everything else. On the table inside sat a laptop, a tool she'd resisted for years, but now accepted as necessary for managing the Clay Foundation. She'd spent the past 6 months learning to use it, reviewing applications, making decisions about who needed help and who was just looking for an easy handout. The Foundation's first major grant had gone to the Northern Forest Alliance, protecting 5,000 acres of old-growth forest adjacent to her own land. Theodore would have approved, but the grants she was proudest of were smaller, more personal. The woman in Idaho who'd refused to sell her family farm to developers and been cut off by her children as a result, Noreen had helped her establish a conservation easement and funded agricultural equipment she needed to keep the farm viable. The elderly man in Wyoming, facing medical bankruptcy because his children wouldn't help, Noreen had paid his bills and set up a trust for his ongoing care. The young woman disowned by her religious family for refusing an arranged marriage, Noreen had funded her education and living expenses until she could support herself. 50 people so far, all of them cast out or pushed aside by families that valued obedience over integrity. Theodore's money helping Theodore's people, as he'd always intended. Vincent visited every Thursday, a standing appointment they'd kept without fail. He brought his daughter Stephanie sometimes, now healthy and waiting for her transplant with all medical costs covered. The trust Noreen had established would ensure Stephanie never had to worry about medical bills again, regardless of what happened with the transplant. "How's the foundation work going?" Vincent asked during his last visit, sitting on the porch with coffee just like Noreen did every morning. "Good. Overwhelming sometimes. There are so many people who need help." She'd shown him some of the applications, heartbreaking stories of people who'd done the right thing and been punished for it. "You're changing lives." Uncle Theodore would be proud. "I hope so." She'd thought about Theodore constantly these past months, wondering if she was making the choices he'd wanted, honoring his vision correctly. But the work felt right. Every grant she approved, every person she helped, felt like a small act of defiance against families like theirs that valued money over people. Gordon and Lorraine hadn't contacted her since the hearing. She'd heard through Vincent that Gordon had filed for bankruptcy, that Lorraine had moved in with a cousin. Their self-inflicted problems continued, but they were no longer Noreen's concern or responsibility. She'd offered, through Vincent, to help them indirectly if they showed genuine change, no direct money, but assistance with medical care, honest debts, things that would help rather than enable. Neither had responded. Pride, apparently, was more important than survival. That was their choice to make. The foundation kept her busier than she'd ever been. She'd hired an assistant, a young woman named Amanda, who worked remotely but visited twice a month to help with paperwork and grant processing. Amanda had been disowned by her own family for being gay, understood intimately the kind of people Noreen was trying to help. Amanda had said during her last visit, not just giving money away, but showing people that their choices mattered, that standing up for themselves was worth it. That was the point, Noreen realized. The money helped, yes, but more than that, it validated. It said to people who'd been told they were wrong, stubborn, foolish, "You were right. Your integrity mattered. Here's help so you don't have to fight alone anymore." She'd protected 40,000 acres of forest so far, bought and preserved as conservation land that would never be developed. Her own 80 acres had become the cornerstone of a larger project, a wildlife corridor extending through 3 counties, protected forever through easements and careful purchases. Her mother would have been proud. Theodore was certainly proud, wherever he was. And Noreen herself felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose that extended beyond personal survival, meaning that came from helping others, connection to a legacy that would outlast her. She still lived simply, still preferred her own company to crowds, still found peace in solitude and the forest. The inheritance hadn't changed who she was. It had just given her the tools to be that person on a larger scale. Vincent's reconciliation had proven genuine. He'd testified against Gordon despite the cost, had rebuilt his relationship with Noreen slowly and honestly, had never asked for anything beyond what she'd already offered. They'd never be as close as siblings raised together might be, but they had something real: mutual respect, honest communication, the beginnings of trust. That satisfied Theodore's condition. Noreen had reconciled with one family member, genuinely and meaningfully. She'd distributed 35 million of the required 50, with clear plans for the remaining 15. And she'd honored Theodore's wishes about Gordon and Lorraine. They'd gotten nothing directly, and nothing they hadn't earned through changed behavior. Boone nudged her hand, reminding her it was time for breakfast. She smiled and turned toward the cabin, the dogs following. Inside, beside the laptop, sat the photographs she'd kept from her mother's collection. Theodore as a young man, smiling and hopeful. Her mother and Theodore together before the family destroyed that bond. Herself as a child on Theodore's lap, proof that they'd known each other once, that he'd held her before the world, taught them both to be cautious about who they trusted. She'd created a small memorial on the wall, photos of Theodore, copies of his letters, the handwritten note he'd left with his conditions. A reminder of why she was doing this, whose legacy she was honoring. Her phone buzzed with a new grant application. Noreen read through it. A man in his 50s, cast out by his extended family for refusing to join a multi-level marketing scheme they were all involved in. He'd lost his job, his home, was living in his car while trying to find work. His crime was recognizing a scam and refusing to participate. Noreen approved emergency funds immediately, enough for first and last month's rent on an apartment job. Training in a field he'd always wanted to pursue, a used car to replace the one falling apart. Within an hour, the money would be in his account. His life stabilized, his choice to maintain integrity rewarded rather than punished. This was why Theodore had given her the money. Not to make her comfortable, she'd been comfortable enough in her cabin with her dogs and her land, but to give her power to help people who needed exactly what they'd needed 40 years ago. Someone to stand up and say, "You were right. Here's help. You're not alone anymore." She made breakfast for herself and the dogs, the morning routine unchanged by wealth or responsibility. Coffee, oatmeal, time on the porch, watching the forest wake up. Then to the laptop, working through applications, researching conservation opportunities, managing the foundation that was becoming Theodore's lasting memorial. Around noon, Amanda called with questions about a particularly complex case. They talked for an hour, working through the details, ensuring the help they offered was genuine and useful rather than a temporary band-aid. "You know what's amazing?" Amanda said toward the end of the call. "We're not just helping individuals. We're showing their families that casting people out has consequences, that the ones they rejected might end up being the ones with resources and power. It's beautiful, really." Noreen hadn't thought of it that way, but Amanda was right. Every person they helped sent a message to the families that had rejected them. Your judgment was wrong. The person you cast out was worth more than you realized. Maybe you should reconsider how you treat people who won't conform. She doubted most families would learn that lesson. Gordon and Lorraine certainly hadn't. But even if only a few people reconsidered their treatment of difficult family members, that was progress. Evening came, bringing the quiet Noreen had always treasured. She sat on her porch with her dogs, watching stars emerge overhead. The forest was full of night sounds, owls hunting, small creatures moving through undergrowth, the creek murmuring over stones worn smooth by time. This was still her favorite time. Money hadn't changed that. The inheritance had added responsibility and purpose, but it hadn't stolen her peace. She thought about Theodore in his small Seattle apartment, watching from a distance, hoping someone in the family would prove worthy of trust. She thought about her mother's journal, the regret that had colored her final days. She thought about Gordon and Lorraine, still fighting against a reality that wouldn't bend to their desires. And she thought about herself 61 years old, wealthier than she'd ever imagined, still living in a cabin her grandfather built, still finding meaning in simplicity and connection to land. "We did it, Teddy," she said quietly to the stars. "We proved them wrong. We showed them that some things matter more than money, and that the people they cast out were exactly the ones who deserved power when it came." The forest didn't answer, but she felt Theodore's presence in the wind, through pines, in the land she'd protected, in the lives she was changing with money he'd earned and saved and left for exactly this purpose. She'd been cast out, she'd stood alone, she'd chosen integrity over approval, and in the end, she'd won. Not because she had money now that was just a tool, but because she'd proven that standing your ground when everyone tells you you're wrong is sometimes the bravest, truest thing you can do. Theodore had known that. Her mother had learned it too late. Noreen had lived it. And now, with the Clay Foundation helping others do the same, that lesson would ripple forward, protecting and validating people who chose principle over convenience, who valued land over profit, who understood that family meant nothing if it was built on betrayal. Boone's head rested on her knee. Sybil pressed against her, sighed. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Noreen Clay sat on her porch, wealthy beyond measure in all the ways that mattered, and understood finally what Theodore had been trying to tell her. Money doesn't change who you are. It reveals it. She'd been revealed as exactly who she'd always been, stubborn, principled, unwilling to compromise what mattered for what was convenient. And that, it turned out, was precisely who the world needed her to be.